So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings, where we'll begin with a new text today. And it's going to be Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, which is one of the foundational books on feminism as we know it today. So it's one of those books in the 20th century which laid the template for much of feminist writings, much of feminist movements, which was to follow subsequently. And it's a book which is profoundly political, but also personal, and it talks about female experience, and it's one of those really key texts which talk about the entanglement between textuality and experientiality. It talks about the discursive formation of woman, what is the woman in a cultural context, how is it culturally constructed through different discursive mechanisms. And of course, it brings back your attention to the entire experientiality of the woman. So it's one of those really interesting arguments which is one of the cornerstones of this kind of study. And one can't really think about a feminist writing course without The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. So the very name Second Sex, as you probably know, is quite provocative. So it talks about how the woman becomes the embodiment of sexuality. The woman becomes sexualized in terms of identity. The woman becomes a sexualized marker, and the woman becomes a body, as opposed to which the male is always rational, bodiless, and of course asexual in quality, because the male inhabits the public space, where the viscerality of the body, the viscerality of identity need to be effaced away. So we'll talk about, Beauvoir will talk about how the bodily underpinnings, the corporeal underpinnings of womanhood is constantly sort of hinted at, is constantly emphasized in any argument about woman, whereas the corporeal underpinning of masculinity or manhood is sometimes strategically effaced away. Man becomes almost a universal condition, a universal idea. And this whole idea, this whole notion of the idea as opposed to corporeality is something that Beauvoir unpacks quite provocatively in this particular book. And the reason why this book is so important, not just for feminist writings, but also for any study of power, hierarchy, domination, etc., is it talks about how the other is created, how the other is produced through different discursive mechanisms, which includes language, dress, of course, culture, which is a very loaded term, religion, and of course the whole idea of masculinity and femininity. And we can see how this kind of model of study, how the other is created, would work remarkably well, perfectly well, if we map it onto, let's say, colonialism and post-colonialism, if we map it onto the racial question, how the other race is created, the racial other is created, etc. So these questions become really key in this particular book. So what we will do in this lecture and lectures to come is we'll look at the introduction to The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir for as long as we can, because I think the introduction sums up the book quite coherently, and it talks about what she expands later on in this book. So instead of looking at the entire book, which will not be practically possible for the purpose of this course, for the scope of this course, it's interesting, it's important for us to probably take a look at the introduction and all this comprehensive details in terms of what Beauvoir sets out to do, in terms of the arguments that she is proposing, and in terms of how the arguments are resonant in the world we live in today. So this is The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir on the screen, translated and edited by H.M. Parsley. So we'll begin with the introduction. Okay, so this is the introduction to Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, and we'll find how the tone of the introduction is interesting because it keeps switching between the personal and the political. It keeps switching between the experiential and the textual. And I know you begin to figure out very quickly that the two are not really opposites in Beauvoir's study. It's not really the personal versus the political. It's not really the experiential versus the textual, but it's the same thing, really. So she talks about how these things, these categories should be straddled. These categories should be co-inhabited in any understanding of femininity, masculinity, and gender in general. Okay, so this is an introduction to Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, written by the writer herself. For a long time, I have hesitated to write a book on woman. The subject is irritating, especially to women, and it is not new. Enough ink has been spilled in quarreling over feminism, and perhaps we should say no more about it. It is still talked about, however, for the voluminous nonsense uttered during the last century seems to have done little to illuminate the problem. After all, is there a problem? And if so, what is it? Are there women, really? Most assuredly, the theory of the eternal feminine still has its adherents, who will whisper in your ear, even in Russia, women are still women. And other erudite persons, sometimes the very same, say with a sigh, woman is losing her way, woman is lost. One wonders if women still exist, if they will always exist, whether or not it's desirable that they should, what place they occupy in this world. and what the place should be. What has become of woman was asked recently in an ephemeral magazine. So, at the very beginning, it takes a slightly flippant tone, but obviously we recognize quite quickly that the flippancy is deliberate because it begins to ask really dark questions. It talks about the different conflicting ideas of woman. It talks about how the woman question becomes a troubling question, sometimes an irritating question. It hints at the markers of essentialism, which is something which we'll keep coming back to throughout this introduction. It talks about how the possibility of emancipation is thwarted by women themselves, etc. And it talks about some of the pseudo-scholarship that tries to pass off as emancipatory feminist scholarship. So that's the foundation that Beauvoir is setting out in the very introduction of this book. And now she asks some really fundamental and key questions, which she begins to expand and unpack as she moves on. But first we must ask, what is a woman? Total Muller in Utero says, 1, woman is a womb. So, at the very beginning she talks about how the entire idea of the woman is reduced to the womb, the sexuality, the sexual body, or the sexualized body. And this whole idea of underpinning the entire idea of womanhood into viscerality, into the body, into corporeality, is something that Beauvoir keeps talking about as she moves on. And she'll contrast it with how conveniently the man, seems to have no body at all. The man becomes rationality, the man becomes idea, the man becomes a very, very intellectual phenomenon who inhabits the public space, etc., as opposed to the woman who is all body and all womb, right? So that underpinning, that essentialism is something that Beauvoir is pointing out very clearly at the very beginning of this introduction. So woman is a womb. That's one of the key responses to this very fundamental question, what is a woman? But in speaking of certain women, Kenosis declare that they are not women, although they are equipped with a uterus like the rest. They agree in recognizing the fact that females exist in the human species. Today, as always, they make up about 1/2 of humanity, and yet we are told that femininity is in danger. We are exhorted to be woman, remain woman, become woman. It will appear, then, that every female human being is not necessarily a woman. To be so considered, she must share in that mysterious and threatened reality known as femininity. Is this attribute sometimes secreted by the ovaries, or is it a Platonic essence, a product of the philosophic imagination? Is a rustling petticoat enough to bring it down to earth? Although some women try zealously to incarnate the essence, it is hardly patentable. It is frequently described in vague and dazzling terms that seem to have been borrowed from the vocabulary of the seers. And indeed, at the times of St. Thomas, it was considered an essence certainly defined by some somniferous virtue of the poppy. So, we talk about, Beauvoir talks about how there are some different kinds of notions about the woman which are ephemeral in quality, which are over-essentialized in quality, which over-essentializes the sexual body, the corporeal body, and also it can also be reified in imagination. It can be romanticized in imagination. And either way, it takes away the reality of the woman experience, the reality, the experientiality of the woman experience, where we reduce it to the body, or you make it a Platonic idea, or you make it a romantic idea, an ideal idea, right? So in either way, you're reifying it in different terms. Now, if you take this, and if you remember what we did towards the end of Donna Haraway's The Cyborg Manifesto, where, at the end she declares quite provocatively that, she would much rather be a cyborg than a goddess. That whole idea of being a cyborg, or, preferring to be a cyborg, is something that is a very political preference, of course, because the goddess comes with the entire apparatus of reification, which is phallogocentric in quality. The goddess is conjured in male imagination. The goddess is conferred by male imagination, whereas the cyborg is something which offers you more ownership into your incomplete essence, right? So in that sense, Haraway could be seen as some kind of a sequel to what Beauvoir seems to be suggesting over here, very, very covertly. Okay, but conceptualism has lost ground. The biological and social sciences no longer admit the existence of unchangeably fixed entities that determine given characteristics, such as those ascribed to woman, the Jew, or the Negro. Now, this is what I meant when I said at the beginning, when we started off this essay, that this work can be equally applied, can be equally relevant to any understanding of race studies, any understanding of colonial studies, any understanding of sort of any kind of discrimination studies. Because what it does at a very fundamental structural level, it talks about the production of the other. How is the other produced? What is the necessity of producing the other? So the other becomes the political necessity of a form of political production which is used to sort of contrast with the aspired identity, with the authentic identity. So the other becomes the opposite, the complete reversal of the aspired identity. And now, of course, in human history, there are certain categories which have been consistently attacked, consistently discriminated. So the woman, the Jew, the Negro, the black, they have been completely consistently discriminated throughout human history. Now, what Beauvoir says over here quite clearly is that, unfortunately for the patriarchal imagination, the biological and social sciences no longer admit that there is some essential difference between the man and the woman in terms of psychology. There's some essential difference between the Negro and the white man. There's an essential difference between the Jew and the non-Jew. So you can't really make this demarcation based on biology anymore, and that's something which has lost ground. So conceptualism has lost ground. That's what she means. The science regards any characteristic as a reaction dependent in part upon a situation. So instead of an essential condition, science has moved towards a more situational condition. So it depends on the context, depends on culture, depends on the situation which produces certain identities. Now that becomes more important than the essence. There's no essential difference between the Jew and the non-Jew, between the Negro and the non-Negro, between the woman and the man, according to modern science. If today femininity no longer exists, then it never existed. But does the word woman then have no specific content? Now, she's obviously moving into the category of the woman as a cultural construct, woman as a rhetoric, woman as a coinage, woman as a term, as a construct. So that's something which we'll see even later when we read Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, which talks about gender as a performance, when you can become a woman, when you can become a man through certain performances, through certain sanctioned and sometimes subversive performances. Okay. This is stoutly affirmed by those who hold to the philosophy of the Enlightenment, of rationalism, of nominalism. Women to them are merely the human beings arbitrarily designed or designated by the word woman, right? So the entire idea of phallogocentric classification, phallogocentric being a combination of phallocentric and logocentric, which is male logic, essentially. We find that has been invested heavily, that has invested itself heavily into the entire idea of enlightenment, the entire production of enlightenment theories and the entire production of enlightenment philosophies, etc. Now, the woman questioned, the Enlightenment, the philosophers of Enlightenment, they keep telling us that women to them are merely the human beings arbitrarily designed by the word woman. So the word woman is conferred on these individuals, is conferred on these human beings, and as a result of which certain classifications have been produced immediately. Now, many American women particularly are prepared to think that there is no longer any place for woman as such. If a backward individual still takes herself for a woman, her friends advise her to be psychoanalyzed and thus get rid of the obsession. In regard to her work, Modern Woman, the Lost Sex, which in other respects has irritating features, Dorothy Parker has written, and this is Beauvoir quoting Dorothy Parker, quote, "I cannot be just to books which treat a woman as woman. My idea is that all of us, men as well as women, should be regarded as human beings," unquote. But nominalism is a rather inadequate doctrine, and the anti-feminists have had no trouble in showing that women simply are not men. Now, this is one of the primary arguments, one of the primary theses in this particular book: identification through negation. Woman as being not men, right? So the whole idea of woman is premised or produced through a lack. The fact that you're not a man, that becomes your marker of identity or identification. That's something that Beauvoir sort of unpacks quite strongly and quite robustly in this particular introduction. So women simply are not men. Surely woman is, like man, a human being, but such a declaration is abstract. So that's an insufficient declaration in terms of highlighting, or in terms of aspiring for any equality as such. The fact is that every concrete human being is always a singular, separate individual. To decline to accept such a notion as the eternal feminine, the black soul, the Jewish character, is not to deny that Jews, Negroes, women exist today. This denial does not represent a liberation for those concerned, but rather a flight from reality. Okay, so she talks about, and this is something which later on Gayatri Spivak would take and make into something mappable onto race and ethnicities. Spivak would use the terms strategic essentialism, how we should essentialize sometimes strategically in terms of resisting hegemonic discourses, in terms of resisting hegemonic identity formations, because if you essentialize with a sense of agency, so agentic essentialization or strategic essentialism, that would sometimes be helpful in terms of producing and protecting an identity to be consumed and invaded by a more hegemonic identity. So Beauvoir says something similar over here. She's saying that it's important for us to understand that the Jews are an identity, the blacks are an identity, women are an identity. So just say that everyone is an individual, and to blur away all distinctions would often be can often be counterproductive, could often be unrealistic, could rather than being emancipatory, rather than being liberatory, it can sometimes be a flight from reality. And that's something which is obviously undesirable in feminist discourses. Some years ago, a well-known woman writer refused to permit her portrait to appear in a series of photographs specially devoted to women writers. She wished to be counted among the men. So, Beauvoir gives an anecdotal example over here, and that's something which will keep running throughout this book. There's a very interesting combination of anecdotal examples and theoretical and textual study and discursive study. So she talks about an unnamed writer who refused, a woman writer, refused to be photographed for a woman magazine or for a gallery of women writers, and she's insisted rather that she should be photographed with the males, with everyone else, as it were. But in order to gain this privilege, she made use of her husband's influence, and that's the irony of it. In order to gain the influence and gain the privilege of being photographed with the men, so as to move away from the woman question, this particular unnamed writer had to take help from her husband in terms of using his influence. Women who assert that they are men lay claim nonetheless to masculine consideration and respect. I recall also a young Trotskyite standing on a platform at a boisterous meeting and getting ready to use her fists in spite of her evident fragility. She was denying her feminine weakness, but it was for love of a militant male whose equal she wished to be. So again, the aspiration is towards becoming a man, to move away from being considered to be a woman. And that, according to Beauvoir, is quite problematic in quality, because that can very easily give way to male appropriations, give way to male negations of any kind of feminine identity, any kind of female identity, any kind of feminist identity, for the matter. The attitude of defiance of many American women proves that they're haunted by a sense of the femininity. So femininity becomes a dirty word, as it were. So women want to get rid of femininity. They want to move away from femininity and be considered as one of the men, as one of the human beings, as it were. But that to Beauvoir is very, very problematic, as we keep saying. In truth, to go for a walk with one's eyes open is enough to demonstrate that humanity is divided into two classes of individuals whose clothes, faces, bodies, smiles, gaze, interests, and occupations are manifestly different. Perhaps these differences are superficial, perhaps they're destined to disappear. What is certain is that they do most obviously exist. Now, what Beauvoir is saying, what Beauvoir is saying over here is that we need to calibrate and recognize the differences, right? We need to recognize the difference between a man and a woman. We need to recognize the difference between the way a man looks, the way a man dresses, the way a man walks, and the way a woman walks. And that difference, the recognition of the difference, the awareness of differences is helpful, is interesting, and is important. Because if you level away all these differences, that can very easily be co-opted into one big male narrative of appropriation and aspiration that would take away any sense of, or any agency of womanhood, any agency of femininity, etc. That is certainly undesirable according to Beauvoir's imagination, according to Beauvoir's feminist discourse. If her functioning is as a female is not enough to define woman, if we decline also to explain her true, the eternal feminine, and if nevertheless we admit provisionally the women do exist, then we must face the question, what is a woman? So the fundamental question comes back, what is a woman? To state the question is to me to suggest at once a preliminary answer. The fact is, I ask in itself is significant. So the very question that you're asking this question, the very notion that you're asking this question, the very idea of asking this question, that is important, because that tells you something politically, the fact that you're asking this question about what is a woman. And Beauvoir would say very quickly that would you ask the same about a man? Would you ever ask what is a man? Of course he wouldn't, because a man becomes a universal category. We speak about man and human beings together in the same sense, in the same vocabulary. So we talk about mankind as a word which represents eternal humanity. So the question, what is a man, becomes a bit of a reductionist question. It becomes paradoxical question. It's a question about nothing really. Whereas a question about woman triggers many responses. It triggers debates, conflicts, and all kinds of responses. So that's what she says away quite clearly before. The fact that I ask it is in itself significant. A man would never set out to write a book on the peculiar situation of the human male. So there'll be no book about the human male, about the masculine condition, as it were, because that becomes more of a universal category which is just accepted and internalized and consumed by all of us ad infinitum. But if I wish to define myself, and Beauvoir is speaking obviously from her subject position, but if I wish to define myself, I must first of all say I'm a woman. On this truth must be based on all further discussion. A man never begins by presenting himself as an individual of a certain sex. It goes without saying that he is a man. The terms masculine and feminine are used symmetrically only as a matter of form, as on legal papers. In actuality, the relation of the two sexes is not quite like that of two electrical poles, for a man represents both the positive and the neutral, as is indicated by the common use of man to designate human beings in general, whereas woman represents only the negative, defined by the limiting criteria without reciprocity. So she's using electoral metaphors away here, where she says that if you imagine to be a positive, negative, and neutral charges, so man represents not just positive, but also the neutral. So the man is humanity, man is human beings, etc. Whereas woman is a negative pole, which is defined by a lack, defined by an absence, defined by an aspiration or an incompletion towards becoming a male. So woman represents only the negative, defined by limiting criteria without reciprocity. So the limitations, the woman is defined by a limitation, woman is defined by a lack, by a sense of incompletion, and that incompletion, that lack, becomes a permanent marker of womanhood, according to Beauvoir's study. And that's something that she's obviously contesting and arguing and unpacking. In the midst of an abstract discussion, it is vexing to hear a man say, "You think thus, and so because you're a woman." But I know that my only defense is to reply, "I think thus, and so because it is true," thereby removing any subjective self from the argument. It would be out of the question to reply, "And you think the contrary because you are a man," for it is understood that the fact of being a man is no peculiarity. So this is a key thing over here. Woman is a peculiarity, man as a universality, and that's the equation that Beauvoir is unpacking very, very robustly. When you talk about a man or a man's aspiration, a man's prerogatives, a man's privileges, those oftentimes, or more often than not, appear as universal categories. Whereas if you talk about the woman's peculiarities, the peculiarities itself, they cover the privileges, the prerogatives, the problems. They all are condensed into this idea of peculiarity. So the idea of peculiarity belonging to woman and universality belonging to man is something that Beauvoir is very, very clearly demarcating and saying that this is something, this is a means by which we operate, not just discursively, but also linguistically. This is the way language operates. This is the way language is designed, religion is designed, culture is designed, everything is designed according to these categories. Whereas what belongs to the man becomes a universal condition, what is ascribed to a woman becomes a peculiar condition. So this peculiarity and universality equation is something which Beauvoir is very, very clearly mapping out and studying and expanding, exploring for us. A man is in the right in being a man. It is a woman who is in the wrong. It amounts to this. Just for us, the ancients, there was an absolute vertical with reference to which the oblique was defined. So there was an absolute human type, the masculine. So she's using mathematical and geometrical analogy over here, where she says for the ancient, let's say the ancient Greeks and Romans or the Indians, where there was an absolute vertical, in relation to it there was other obliques. So there was a vertical thing, a 90-degree angle or whatever, according to which all the other angles are defined and demarcated. So that could be usually mapped onto the idea of masculine and feminine, because that's an absolute vertical being the male reason, male rationality, male prerogatives, male privileges, etc., which become universal phenomena, which become universal categories very quickly and by default. Whereas the woman question, they become peculiarities, they become angularities in relation to the verticality, right? So this idea of angularity versus verticality, the relationship between peculiarity versus universality is something that Beauvoir is clearly mapping out. So the absolute human type happens to be the masculine type by default, Woman has ovaries, a uterus. These peculiarities imprison her in her subjectivity, circumscribe her within the limits of her own nature. It is often said that she thinks with her glands, and so this is the viscerality which is ascribed to the woman, that she has an ovary, she has a uterus, she thinks with her glands. So she's not outside of a prison house of her body, as it were. She's not outside the prison house of secretions, as it were. Now, what is conveniently forgotten, and this is what Beauvoir would very quickly say, that that male to have glands, male to secrete glands, male to have organs which secrete the way chemicals form inside the male body, but the body of the man is very, very conveniently effaced away. And what we have instead is an idea of rationality which belongs to male, which belongs to the man, which is owned by men. And the question of agency becomes quite clear immediately with these categories of description. So it is often said that she thinks with her glands. The woman thinks with her glands. So this is why the word hysteria, for instance, is was believed for a long time to be the malady that comes from the uterus, the malady that comes from the womb. So it can only happen to women. Only women can be hysteric in quality because they have the uterus, the womb, which secrete certain things which make them womanly and sane and mad and all kinds of things which are ascribed to hysteria. Now, what was conveniently forgotten was the fact that male too became hysterics in different situations, and it is only the First World War which brought male hysteria to the public space with the form of shell shock and trauma and all the rest of it. And then, of course, different words had to be invented to define male hysteria. So we have PTSD much later during the Vietnam War. In the First World War, we had shell shock. So what is obviously clear here is the fact that hysteria was supposed to be a female malady because the females are supposed to have a body which is supposed to have secreted glands and which would then create problems for the body, which would overdetermine the way she thinks. And the whole idea of overdetermination is important over here. The woman is overdetermined by the body. The woman is imprisoned by the body. Now, what she says quite clearly before is that man superbly ignores the fact that his anatomy also includes glands. So this is what I meant at the beginning when I said that there's an idea that men don't have body. Men are all rationality. Men are all ideas. Men are all brains. And the whole idea of effacing the body becomes a very political strategy, whereas the body becomes something to be shamed, where the body becomes something to be sexualized, when the body becomes something to be reified and objectified because it belongs to the woman. But because a man doesn't happen to have a body, the body disappears from the man. It's all about the ideas and the brain and the imagination and the intellect and all the rest of it, which inhabit the public space. Okay? So man superbly ignores the fact that his anatomy also includes glands, such as testicles, and that they secrete hormones. So Beauvoir says quite clearly, even men have testicles, men have glands which secrete hormones just as much as women do. But for some reason, in public discourse and public understanding and normal understanding, quote-unquote normal, normative understanding, the secretion of men, the secretion of males is just very, very conveniently effaced away. And what we have instead is a complete, a recurrent understanding of the woman having the body, woman possessing the body, or controlling the body, or the body controlling the woman rather, through secretions, which then make her bizarre or hysteric or problematic in quality. Whereas the man, as Beauvoir says quite clearly, he thinks of his body as a direct and normal connection with the world, which he believes he apprehends objectively, whereas he regards the body of woman as a hindrance, a prison, weighed down by everything peculiar to it. So again, the whole idea of peculiarity versus universality, it keeps coming back. So the male, the man, very conveniently effaces his own body, and he thinks of his own body as a direct and normal connection with the world, as being at one with the world. So there's no difference between the male body and the world outside. So it becomes one from an extended and continuous and seamless embodiment, whereas for the woman, the embodiment is very, very visible. The embodiment is very, very localized. So if you use embodiment studies metaphors, the woman's embodiment is localized and it is sort of reified to a large extent, whereas the male embodiment is extended. It's not reified. It's not localized at all. And in the extended quality of male embodiment lies as aspiration, or lies as the whole idea of universality. It is just universal phenomenon. There's no need to pay attention separately to the male body, because the man's body is just a universal phenomenon, whereas the woman's body is full of interruptions. A woman's body is an imprisonment. A woman's body is a hindrance, a lack, a problem. Right? So that's the equation that Beauvoir is very clearly unpacking over here. And then she keeps quoting some of the ancient philosophers who obviously are all males, and how they looked at the woman question, how they looked at the woman's body in this kind of a relation, this kind of a perspective. And this is Aristotle as quoted by Beauvoir. The female is a female by virtue of a certain lack of qualities, says Aristotle. So, the female is defined by a lack. And we should regard the female nature as afflicted with a natural defectiveness. So the whole idea of female is a defect, is a dysfunctional category. It's an incomplete man, according to Aristotle. And the whole idea of female, the female is only a female because she lacks certain things which obviously belong to the men, which obviously belong to the males, who belong to the universal category of existence. So the woman, because of her incompletion, because of her interruptions, because of her defectiveness, the woman becomes interrupted in quality, and the woman becomes afflicted in quality, right? So the whole idea of affliction, interruption, incompletion, defectiveness, these become part of the peculiarity package of the female, as opposed to the universality package of the male, who is rational and perfect and seamless and continuous, at one with the environment around him. And next we have St. Thomas. And St. Thomas, for his part, pronounced woman to be an imperfect man, an incidental being. It's almost like an accident, an incidental being, not something which is normative or normal in quality. So it's incidental quality, the peculiar quality of woman, which is something which keeps coming up even in ancient philosophies and philosophers. This is symbolized in Genesis, where Eve is depicted and as made from what Bosé call a supernumerary bone of Adam. So Eve is made out of Adam's ribs, for the matter. So it's just a part of Adam. So when you talk about making something out of someone's rib, so that obviously denotes woman to be a very metonymic representation of man, a fragment of man, as it were. So Eve is created out of a rib bone of Adam. So Adam being the whole body, Adam being the universal body, and Eve becoming a part of the body, a fragment of the body. So even in the book of Genesis, we find this kind of a discourse of male universality as opposed to female peculiarity is manifestly present. Thus humanity is male, and man defines woman not in herself, but as relative to him. So woman becomes only in relation to a man. So man becomes the universal phenomenon, woman becomes a peculiar phenomenon in relation to man. So if you go back to the mathematical, the geometrical analogy that de Beauvoir offered, so man is a right angle, man is the vertical angle, in relation to which all the other angles define themselves, in relation to which all the other angles situate themselves. The woman becomes situational, apropos of man, apropos of the universality of man. So this idea of relationality, this idea of peculiarity belongs to woman, and this just makes them different from man in sense of incompletion or imperfection. Okay? Michel writes, woman, the relative being, and Bender is most positive in his Rapide Real, the body of man makes sense in itself quite apart from that of woman, whereas the latter seems wanting in significance by itself. Man can think of himself without woman. She cannot of herself without man. So man is self-sufficient, man is universal, man is all-encompassing, whereas woman becomes a relation apropos of man, only in relation to man, and apart from that she doesn't have an existence of her own. And she is simply what man decrees, what man confers on her, what man authorizes. So woman is only that which man authorizes and produces out of that authorization. Thus she is called the sex, by which is meant that she appears essentially to the male as a sexual being. For him, she is sex, absolute sex, no less. So this is what I meant at the beginning when I said that Beauvoir suggests that women become sexualized beings, that they have a sexualized body, they have a sexualized corporeal quality. Because they have, they are all body, and that obviously from a male imagination, from a male perspective, becomes the embodiment of sexuality, absolute sexuality, no more, no less. She is defined and differentiated with reference to man, and not he with reference to her. So it's always the woman who's compared to the man. So man becomes the right angle, the vertical angle, as I mentioned with the geometric analogy, with reference to which woman defines herself. She is the incidental, the inessential, as opposed to the essential. He is the subject, he is the absolute, she is the other. So this is the question that we will stop with today in this lecture, the question of other. Because, as I mentioned at the beginning, that the way Beauvoir unpacks the production of other, the way Beauvoir examines the production of other, is something which can be mapped onto even other discourse formations, even other hierarchy formations, such as race, for instance, such as discrimination, for instance. So the way the other is produced, apropos of the imagined right, apropos of the imagined perfect, is something which is historically true for almost any episode, any narrative of exploitation, any narrative of domination, any narrative of hierarchization. So he is the subject, he is the absolute, so man is the absolute, the universal, as opposed to which the woman is the other, the angular, the peculiar, right? So in the next lecture we'll move on and to see how Beauvoir talks about the other question in terms of how the other is produced, how it's a political production, of course, and how it's a necessary political production for the man to imagine himself as universal, as the seamless, as a continuous, as a right, as the absolute subject, compared to which everything else becomes relative in quality. So I end this lecture today, and I'll continue with this in the lectures to come. Thank you for your attention.